So let's take a look at what the relationship is between, redlining and food deserts. So, the first thing is that redlining was a tool that was used to divide cities along racial lines, right? So segregation was brought about by using redlining to create areas that were deemed less desirable, and then African-American populations were concentrated disproportionately into those neighborhoods. And oftentimes those areas were sites of environmental hazards, as you noted, flood zones, for example, or industrial or factory corridors. And those areas are obviously not as desirable as places that are far from industrial or factory sites. And so they were less desirable. People who could move out left, people who had resources to do that, and then other populations were just sort of concentrated in those areas. So how does that impact populations? Well, in America, one of the primary ways to create personal and generational wealth is through property ownership. And so banks used redlining maps to designate neighborhoods hazardous for investment. And the result was that you could deny home loans to people in these communities. And then the individuals and families in those areas didn't have access to the most direct path for the creation of wealth. And so they lost their homes in many cases, and those homes were bought by slumlords and other people who would rent them back to people who used to own them. When it comes to access to food, that redlining, because of the way that it affected the investment into those neighborhoods, so people didn't own their houses, people couldn't apply for home equity loans to make home improvements. It shaped the distribution of businesses and restaurants. And as a result, supermarket chains avoided redlined neighborhoods, and fast food chains and bodegas, convenience stores, became the primary source of food. Aubrey points out in the chat that it also contributed to the huge wealth gap between white and Black populations today. Absolutely. One of the conversations that I have that I find very frustrating when I'm talking about, attempts to integrate schools better or attempts to improve the access to schools to minority populations is that oftentimes people will say, well, if they don't like the school in the neighborhood, they should just move out. And that is really evidence of how poorly understood this historical practice was. And so here is the distribution of food deserts in Birmingham. And what you can see, if you take this map and overlay it to that historical redlining map, is that the food deserts are primarily in the areas that were redlined, and that they are disproportionately impacting people of color. So if you look on the corridor of the inner city of Birmingham, notice that there's lots and lots of food deserts here, and those food deserts are primarily in impacting African-American populations. That historical practice of redlining, which has now been abolished, thankfully, still perpetuates this system of oppression when it comes to food access by creating and maintaining food deserts.